Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to another episode of NHLN Opinion Plus, a weekly series airing every Friday. This is a space for our opinions where we talk about our current events and questions the Latino community is curious about. Today, we are joined by Moira O'Neill, Director of the Office of the Child Advocate. Welcome, Moira. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. How you been?
I've been pretty good. It's a busy summer.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, really good to hear. So, just a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some the role that you have with child support and serving the needs of children and family within New Hampshire. So, if we could get started with our questions, our first question that we would like to ask is: so, coming out of the pandemic and a difficult and contentious legislative session, what are some of the issues that you're concerned about for the community of New Hampshire?
Sure, thanks. That's a good question, a good place to start. I know New Hampshire, a lot like the rest of the country, has had a lot of difficulty with dealing with the pandemic. And for some reason, at the same time, state legislators have been dealing with very controversial issues. So our immediate concerns are for kids coming out of the pandemic who haven't been to school consistently, kids who have lost grounds in their learning, particularly kids who require special education services. You know, sometimes when you aren't in school every day learning, you really lose a lot of that. And here in New Hampshire, we've also seen a considerable intake or uptick in numbers of kids who are, for the first time, experiencing mental illness issues like anxiety and depression, and also children who are already having those problems, they being exacerbated. So we've had a lot of children in the emergency departments waiting for care. And that's sort of stressed the system and underscored how little prepared we are for dealing with kids who are having difficulties in their social and emotional lives.
Interesting. That I think with the pandemic, we've seen that like the biggest issue that has always been that has always been popping up is mental health. So everybody's like learning from home. So what are some of the ways that you've been coping with like online learning? Because you see elementary school students, students in elementary school, they thrive off of like interpersonal learning, interacting with their peers and their teachers, and now the pandemic just took away all of that. So how have you been coping with building those relationships, because those are really important in creating well-rounded adults in the future?
Yeah, you know, I don't think that we're going to have all the answers to that for a while. I think we're going to be looking back at this group of children and learning a lot about how important it is to make social connections. My office, the Office of the Child Advocate, which oversees children's services, deals with things at a slightly higher sort of systemic level. So we're seeing where how we're supporting kids, how we have programs that are getting out to engage kids, making sure families have what they need. We did a lot of work with educating families about what to look for, neighbors, what to worry about, to make sure family were identified when they need help. But I think one of the big things that the pandemic did, because so many people kids weren't just out of school, people were out of work, right? And that was one of the reasons that it was so complicated. And so state budgets became very, difficult undertakings. And because there wasn't a lot of revenue at the state level, people started seeing a lot of cuts. And so here in New Hampshire, where we lived through terrible tragedies in child welfare just 6 years ago, we're starting to push back to where we were at that time with significant cuts in our state budget, which means significant cuts in services for families who are right at crisis right now and really need those supports.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think many communities all across the country, they definitely face those same issues. So going off of that, what would you say are some of the challenges that Latinx and underrepresented communities in New Hampshire face, specifically within children and children whose parents have lost their jobs due to the pandemic? What are some of their biggest challenges, and how have you been providing support for those children and those families?
Well, yeah. So at the ground level, we've got to get kids back to school. I think we felt a lot of frustration here in the Northeast in general from children who saw that adults in the room weren't being as careful as they needed to be with the pandemic. We heard a lot of complaints from children about adults who were not wearing masks and not doing what they needed to do to keep down the spread of the virus. And we heard a lot of complaining from parents and other adults saying kids shouldn't be required to wear masks, but I don't know that they ever asked the kids that themselves, because all of them that we've encountered have really been able to accommodate and get used to wearing a mask. So there was that issue where there was, kids not feeling supported by the adult system. The bigger issue, I think, that has come up this year, both in practice and out of the legislature, were the issues around racial disparities and racism in general, and particularly systemic racism. So New Hampshire is one of the states that passed legislation that prohibits the teaching of what was referred to as critical race theory. And that's important because what we're seeing in both child protection and juvenile justice is a significant disproportionate measurement of both Black and Hispanic children coming into the system. Interesting, in child protection, what we saw in New Hampshire was there was a much higher rate of Hispanic families being reported for abuse and neglect than white families. Black families almost 2 times more often reported. But when they really looked at the reports, it was far less that it was substantiated. So what that tells you is that people are making assumptions about Black and Hispanic families and the way they raise their kids that aren't actually abuse and neglect. It's a problem because even when you're not found to be abusing or neglecting your kids, just encountering the system has some pretty negative effects, as you can imagine. People coming around and asking you questions about how you take care of your kids is really not a positive experience. And then on the juvenile justice side, we're seeing both Black and Hispanic kids in New Hampshire, where there's only 6% of our children's population is Hispanic, only a little over 2% is African American. And yet they're 3 times more likely to be arrested. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white kids in this state. So when I walk into our youth prison, I see Black and brown faces. I don't see white faces, and that doesn't make sense. Other than that, there's some kind of inbuilt racism in our system that's not taking into consideration how to equitably treat all kids who need our help.
Absolutely, absolutely. And following that, can you explain from your experiences and from the children that you've been serving, what do you think are some of the biggest factors that may influence those high incarceration rates for those people, for groups of people of color?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know. It's hard to answer that question. We do think that if there's higher arrest rates, if there are more reports about families, then people must be seeing something about those families and not quite understanding it, or having some other, sort of negative view of them. And so this is where it's the problem with our recent legislation around critical race theory, is that we have to be able to have conversations to figure that out. And we were in the middle of a really big educational push with law enforcement and with juvenile probation and parole officers about how they think, how they view people who look different, just when the law was passed. So now we could actually be sued for educating people on these issues. And so we have to wait. Obviously, there'll be lawsuits and lots of conversation to see if we can keep that going. We don't think that it's against the law to teach people about institutional racism, but we do think that people will be inhibited to participate because of fear of a lawsuit. And so that's something that we have to work out, because in the meantime, there's children who are coming into the system needlessly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting point that you brought up critical race theory, because I'm from Loudoun County, Virginia, and recently we've had a lawsuit with a PE teacher, with a physical education teacher at an elementary school, who mistakenly used the pronouns of a student who happened to be transgender. Chose not to go along the pronouns of this transgender students for their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
That is all related to critical race theory and how the residents of Loudoun County, how they use how the government uses their tax dollars to raise their children. So I want
Yeah.
to ask, like, within New Hampshire and the work that you have with serving underrepresented children, have you seen those issues of people mistakenly using gender pronouns of students who happen to be transgender
Mhm.
or of those underrepresented populations?
Yeah, I do think that that's happening also in New Hampshire as it is elsewhere. I think that some of that is a culture shift. Some people are just struggle with grammar, and it's difficult to really understand that this is something that's important to an individual, and out of respect, you need to use the right language that they're comfortable with. So one of the things that our office is doing that I can finish with is we're looking for ways to elevate children's voices themselves, because maybe people aren't going to listen to me, but they will listen to young people. And we're finding that the more we talk to young people, the much more reasonable explanations and problem solutions are being put forward, because young people are growing up from the benefits of all of the equal rights legislation that's passed in the years. Like they have integrated classrooms, they're working with people who have disabilities, they're exposed to all of that, so they don't have the biases that the rest of us do from growing up at different times. So the idea is to listen to them. And I encourage all young people, if you have an opinion, if you have an experience, you've got to share that experience so that people understand why it's important to be respectful of each other, and most important, why it's necessary to have these conversations. Whether they're painful or not, we have to understand how people can be comfortable.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I think with having those conversations, it's important to understand how everybody's story is different, how everybody's story
Mhm.
has value.
Yeah.
That, like, I wanted to ask, for to be mindful of time is what how do you think you, like, within your role and with serving children, especially of underrepresented populations, how do you think you are making the effort to try to connect with the underrepresented children, such as children of color, Latinx, and
Mhm.
underrepresented populations? How are you trying to create an environment where they feel valued and they feel belonged within the educational community with other children that happen to not be from an underrepresented population?
Yeah, well, one of the things, as I just mentioned, we're trying to raise children's voices. We're seeking grants to establish a grant program so that we can help community organizations hire young people who have personal experience to do outreach and education programs and to lobby the legislature on issues that are important to them. I also make a point of talking with young people as often as I can, so that when I'm sharing information with someone, I can insert in there that child's story to make sure people can get a sense of what is the lived experience for children who are different, for teenagers who identify differently, and how difficult it is and how distracting it is from the things that they have to focus on, like school, like getting a job, when they feel they're being mistreated or they don't feel safe. And we really celebrate all of the opportunities that, or all of the great things that kids have to contribute. We just had a wonderful art contest for young people to try to express their sense of mental illness. And what we learned just from those works of arts was really stunning. We learned about their experience and we saw beautiful art. And so it's making those kinds of opportunities available as well, and whenever we can, so people will learn to listen to the young people, because that's who knows what's going on at this point.
That is absolutely fascinating. Art
Mhm.
is a really great way to express each other's
Yeah.
feelings and emotions. And it can and a last question following time is what resources would you recommend for residents within New Hampshire?
In New Hampshire, I would say reach out and look for community organizations that are advocating for children. New Futures is a wonderful organization that has some advocacy groups. They're based in Concord, but they advocate especially around legislative issues. Black Lives Matter has been, there's a couple of active chapters here, and we hope to support them and lift them up, because they're focused in general on issues affecting young Black people, but I don't think that they've quite discovered the problems in juvenile justice yet. And that's a great place to really direct some energy there. NAMI, New Hampshire, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, has some really good peer support programs for young people who have experienced mental health difficulties, especially during the pandemic. And once you hook up with one of those, or if people want to call, of course, the Office of the Child Advocate, we're happy to make connections with folks.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Moira. And I think that's our closing. So first, thank you for speaking with us, Director O'Neill, and for being our guest on NHLN Opinion Plus. Is there anything that you would like to say to our audience before we close out?
Well, I would just say thank you. I would say thank you for paying attention to this kind of news, because it's important that you get some real stories and inspire people to be involved. The only way that we're going to make things better is to be involved in it. And so news is where it starts. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Moira. And join us for another episode in 2 weeks. For more information about our discussion today, check out our web story on nhlatinonewscom. Follow us on Twitter at NHLatinoNews and Instagram at NH_Latino News. I'm Brian Zapata from NHLN Opinion Plus, and we'll see you next time.